Alan's been studying ghosts, hauntings, and poltergeists for many years from a data-driven perspective. He's also, as you probably know by now, the literary executor for the late Andrew Green, and his talk looks at the new edition of Phantom Ladies and how a reanalysis points to a widespread ghostly woman in white phenomena, raising the question, who is she? And so, without further ado, I give you Alan Murdie. Alan, are you ready to go?
I hopefully am ready to go. Thank you very much, Christian. That's a very succinct, kind introduction. Yes, we have known each other, and recent Edmonds it seems to be a common factor with one or two people's background in this field, more than a disproportionate number. But anyway, as said, I'm actually going to be talking tonight about a pattern which has emerged from a reanalysis of the book written by Andrew Green, one of the most influential ghost hunters of the second half of the 20th century, whose example, particularly in the 1970s, encouraged, inspired, and indeed continues to shape many efforts in what we call ghost hunting and spontaneous case investigation today. So I have some slides, however, so it's not just a talking head piece. So if we can, hopefully we're set up to share screens. Right, great. Well, let me take you into this. Yes, the book that's just been mentioned was originally written by Andrew Green back in 1977, came out January 1977. Phantom Ladies, it was his third book, major book in the field. He previously published one called Our Haunted Kingdom, which was, I'm pleased to say, one of the first books I ever read myself and a formative influence in my own interest. And he'd also written what was the world's first practical guide to ghost hunting. Ghost Hunting, a Practical Guide was its title in 1973. And that was a work aimed at the non-specialist, the ordinary person who's interested in ghosts, who'd like to try a bit of ghost hunting. And I'm always glad I did read Andrew's books at the beginning, because they gave me, I think, at an impressionable age, a very good grounding in what he sought to do, which was attempt to take a scientific approach to ghosts, to haunting phenomena, to poltergeist activity. And I always remain glad that those were the very first book, among the very first books I read, and they were an influence on me. Because, as you know, it's a vast field. Early impressions count, and I realise I could have ended up going in all kinds of different directions. But let's take us on. This is just a bit about Andrew, his third book, and I've now written as his literary executor since his death 20 years ago. I've been trying to keep his example and his work and his ideas in circulation. And so I brought out this new edition of Phantom Ladies. Now, he looked a bit grim in the previous photograph, but he was a very pleasant, kindly man who I got to know very well in the last 8 years of his life. He had a sense of fun, a good sense of humour to the subject, and he saw himself as a down-to-earth rationalist. He actually used to describe himself as a ghost hunter who did not believe in ghosts, in the sense that he didn't believe that ghosts and haunting phenomena are evidence of survival after death. He thought that they were a kind of mental image, which apparitions are a mental image which linger after the death of the originator. He pointed out you could have ghosts of the living. He thought the answers would be found within, this was, of course, a growth area in the 1970s, parapsychology, with the then and still controversial abilities such as telepathy, clairvoyance, ESP, as it was popularly termed, now termed psi, and also psychokinesis, the apparent ability of the mind to influence matter and the environment. He had, I suppose, his own take, which is, we can find versions of this going back a very long way back into the Victorian, even pre-Victorian era, where people talked about ghostly phenomena as perhaps some kind of electricity. He talked about his ideas were centered on the notion that the brain, as is affected by electromagnetism, it produces or operates as an electrical or electromagnetic system within itself. That's how our nervous system works, and he believes that an extension of that energy could effectively leave the subject, leave the body, and be seen as a mental image. He looked at psi powers, but he did not believe in spirits. And for a long time, although he didn't really formulate his theories to any great extent, for a long time I thought this was likely to be the most probable explanation, a kind of version of what we call stone tape in many cases, though, of course, there's no evidence that stone behaves like a tape recorder. But that was where I thought it was a scientific grounded approach. And he attributed his own interest in phantom ladies and ghostly ladies to his own encounter, or what he felt was a strange encounter, on his first ever ghost hunt. This was at building 16 Montpelier Road in Ealing, which he set about investigating at the age of 17. It was his first ghost hunt, almost his last as well. This was the building, a tall structure, rather grandiose, and at the back you can see a tower which was set in the garden. It was built originally in the 1880s by a man called Wallace Dunlop, who was a judge over in India, and he had delusions of grandeur. I learnt in 2012 from his surviving grandson, and he had this tower built at the back. There were even suggestions that you can see on the side of that tower some strange, possibly Masonic symbol. Well, this house was abandoned sometime around 1934, and it obtained a reputation for being haunted. Stories of repeated tragedies, it was said, amongst the residents and occupiers over some 60-year period, had driven everybody away from it. That was the local story. And this was how it looked, as far as we know, just before the family did leave. The suicide, there were suicides. That was the tale locally. A girl named Hinchcliffe, possibly Anne Hinchcliffe, was the first to jump from that tower at the back of the house to her death. And so the story went, there had been a succession of similar suicides up until the family finally quit. There was apparently another set of residents, it was claimed, and there was a murder and a suicide when they were there, which led to the place being abandoned completely in 1934. And that's how it's looked some 10 years later. This is Andrew's photograph taken on a September morning in September afternoon, sunny day in 1944. He'd been invited in to visit the place by his father, who was the chief air raid and fire precautions officer for that district of Ealing. One of his tasks was to requisition empty buildings to store furniture which had been recovered from places that had been destroyed by enemy action. And finding that there was this big rambling house with a tower, Mr. Green Sr. Said, right, we'll have that to store goods and valuables and furniture in. and he went to conduct an inspection. And he'd heard the stories of the haunting. In fact, he'd found it hard to get anybody locally to assist with renovation work. He had to advertise as far away as Greenford to find workers who apparently didn't shun the place or shudder at the mention of this grim haunted house. And he said to Andrew, who was interested in science, at the time he wanted to become a chemist, he said, "Come along and I'll show you a haunted house." So they duly went along and Andrew took a photograph. And the interesting thing is the window on the top left. You can see right up there. People may be able to make out, first of all, what appears to be a curtain. And, well, it gets a little more interesting. There is a shape when you get a close-up, which some people say or have interpreted, including Andrew himself, as possibly the form of a girl or a young woman at the window. Now, this isn't a very good reproduction here. That is a slightly darkened photograph, but that was taken on Andrew's first investigation. The building was empty. He took this photograph, and we can see this strange what appears to be a net curtain and possibly somebody behind it. And some people can say, when you look at the original, that there is the shape of a woman. Well, that's how the story went. The most significant thing was what actually happened to Andrew whilst he was on the premises. He climbed up the back of that tower that I showed you earlier. He got an impression that he should jump off the roof. A message seemed to go into his mind. He said he went into a semi-trance and he climbed up on the parapet. He was about to jump off the roof when, fortunately for the future of modern ghost hunting, his father pulled him back, saying we don't want any more suicides. But the photograph, well, that puzzled Andrew and got him interested in the subject of ghosts. Well, he then had to go and do some, after the Second World War ended, he had to go and do some national service. But he followed up the story of the haunted house in Ealing and discovered that after the Second World War, it had been renovated. And he contacted the owners who said, no, we're not having anything to do with ghost hunting. But over the next 15 years, he was able to, by very strange coincidences, he kept encountering people who had a connection with 16 Montpelier Road, people who were living in it, who complained of low-level haunting phenomena, footsteps, the pets, a dog that was deeply disturbed and had to be put down. It went into periodic fits every 28 days, stories of strange sulphurous smells, odd noises, and there was one resident, Ken Yandell, who was a BBC producer, who was overcome with what appeared to be sulphur poisoning whilst in the bath and taken to hospital. He showed all the symptoms, but there was no gas supply to his flat, which could account for it. So there was a history of odd things afterwards. This stayed at the back of Andrew's mind, and in early 1961, he was invited onto a television program called Jim's Inn, which featured this actor, Jimmy Hanley, who in a number of post-war 50s British films. He presented this program. It was a kind of program actually designed for selling and advertising products. It was called Jim's Inn, and Andrew, as ghost hunter, was invited onto the program. Talking to Jimmy Hanley, it turned out that he was living in one of these flats, and he testified that yes, there were these horrible smells, there were these strange noises. It was a problematic place. Well, that's what 16 Montpelier Road looks like today, because the original house was demolished completely in 1971 and replaced by this block of flats. But the idea of the ghostly girl, Andrew said himself, he was haunted by this experience he'd had in 1944. He remained puzzled by that photograph. And he said at the same time he did take a sensible or rational approach. He said possibly it's pareidolia, the image. Possibly you are seeing the image there. And he admitted that having shown it to audiences over a great many years, he'd also had people in lectures and talks say to him, well, what about the dog? Or what about the man in the hat? And shortly before he died, at his he gave his last lecture. He said the total population of that window is now 27. The photograph itself was examined by Dr. Barry Colvin in 2014, including the negative, and he said, well, we can't really say what it is in that window other than there has been no tampering with it. So was this a ghost? Personally, I'm skeptical of ghost photography, but it was sufficiently curious, to say the least. But that's what set Andrew off interested in the idea of phantom females. He said that because over the years he felt haunted by the house because he kept running into people who had some connection with it. In fact, the whole thing since his death has now turned into the suicide house of Ealing. I remember back in 1995, I was doing some legal work for a lady who ran what was the oldest established Indian restaurant at Ealing Common, with the original name of the Taj Mahal. And when we dealt with the legal side of the Taj Mahal, we got chatting about ghosts and Ealing history, and it already entered into the folklore of the Asian community in Ealing that there had once been this house where a ghostly girl would appear on the top of a tower and beckon to people to come in, and then she'd push you to your death, or alternatively, you went into the house and climbed up the tower and looked down, and you'd see the girl beckoning to you, and you would jump off the tower. These were the sort of stories that had become folklore, and it's grown beyond it. Well, I did some research into this. I've by great good fortune, and I have the privilege of having a lot of Andrew's original records and archives. From the research that I've done and others, it's difficult to substantiate a pattern or history of suicides. I can't find any record of multiple deaths at 16 Montpelier Road from its building. But again, by an odd coincidence, I got to meet Ian Dunlop Wilson, who was the grandson of the original builder. And I got to, I was helping somebody with an inheritance tax query. Her best friend had died, and she was living with somebody at the time of her death called Ian Dunlop Wilson, and the name rang a bell. So I went to see Mr. Wilson, and it was a good job I did, because he was actually terminally ill. But after we sorted out the inheritance tax issue, I talked to him about the family name and his history. And I met him in a house a flat up in Maida Vale, and he had a big portrait of his grandfather. And he said to me he thought the whole story was greatly exaggerated. The most he knew was there had been apparently a suicide of a servant sometime in the Edwardian era at the house. He said the family did not leave because of a series of deaths and scandals or hauntings. They just simply ran out of money. Basically, his grandfather had been a terrible snob, as well as building 16 Montpelier Road. He had also bought a big property up in Scotland, near Balmoral, because he wanted to be near Queen Victoria, apparently. And he said the whole thing, in his view, had become hugely exaggerated. So, I mean, there is evidence, I would say, of a low-level haunting, and something very peculiar did happen to Andrew Green, because it sent him off on his lifetime interest in collecting ghosts and hauntings. And with Phantom Ladies, the book he compiled in the 1970s, he lists 145 different places around Great Britain, England, Scotland. This is a typical one. Thorpe Hall in Lincolnshire. There, it's supposed to have a ghostly green lady who was supposed to be a Spanish noblewoman who fell in love. This was the Green Lady, and the witness was Paul Hewson, who evacuated during the Second World War at the same time as Andrew Green was having his ghostly adventure at Montpelier Road. Paul Hewson was in a bedroom at Thorpe Hall, and he saw a lady in green come in. Interesting, because he then goes on to write books himself. He becomes an author, a screenwriter, an artist with a strong interest in the esoteric. And he wrote on the tarot. He wrote a book called How to Test and Develop Your ESP, which tells of his experience with the Green Lady. He also, for those of you interested in witchcraft, wrote one of the most notorious books in the modern pantheon of witchcraft, called Mastering Witchcraft, which purports to tell you how to also carry out not just white magic, but black magic as well. But so go careful with Mr. Hewson, it seems. But he had this experience of seeing a phantom lady, and if we in the same district, there's another marvelous story of Queen Boadicea herself coming back as a phantom lady at a place called Meringham, and a researcher called Joan Foreman collected stories and accounts of a strange female ghost believed to be Boudicca, haunting the district. And of course, there's there's just so many of them when we stop to think of it. Place after place claims either particularly a white lady or a grey lady. I mean, in Phantom Ladies, the collection itself, we have examples of blue ladies, red ladies, a couple of brown ladies, ladies in black, and one or two in yellow. But overall, we find that sort of Land's End, John and Groats, the most common one is either a white lady apparition or a grey lady. And it was coming to the book afresh, and also having the benefit of some of Andrew's original notes, and also cases and reports which never made it into the 1977 book, I became aware that there was perhaps a deeper pattern to this. Two things struck me is that in so many of these places, and I did my best to check and make fresh inquiries at a number of the sites to find out if they're active. Yes, they are. Quite a few of them are still reporting activity, or there are new unpublished or unpublished accounts that some of which I've been able to include in the new edition. What started to strike me was that although typically a name might be given for the particular ghost, the haunting lady, she might be identified with a past historic individual, or there was a story or a tradition that it was a particular woman who did live in the past. The actual evidence for identity, if you actually strictly tested it for identity was not at all strong. Very few ghosts were actually recognizable. Very few, when you look at the witness account, if you were trying to prove identity, an eyewitness account, if you had an identity parade in court for a court case, you just wouldn't have clear enough identity with a degree of certainty. And with the examples of a number of them, as I said, the green lady, the red lady, the lady in blue, and so on, she's identified really just in terms of her costume, in terms of her clothing. And even then, the evidence isn't that conclusive, because although there may be a story of a green lady at Thorpe Hall or the brown lady of Raynham Hall, the actual descriptions are very different to what in most cases seems to be a picture or a portrait that once hung or does still hang in the particular premises. And I wonder if that fashion for naming these phantom ladies goes back to the 18th century, when we start to get very rich colours in portraits, and in a much less visually cluttered and sophisticated environment in media terms, these portraits were sensational in their appearance, and they made a deep popular impression. And there's also this tendency in people who experience ghosts to want to be able to identify it as something or somebody. But when we really try to pin down the eyewitness testimony to say this was clearly a woman from the past who exists in historical records, the evidence isn't very clear to establish a connection at all. And what we do keep finding, however, is case after case, all very localized, of what is described as a woman in white, or the white lady, a woman in white clothing. And some of these apparition reports are actually quite disturbing. Spencer Grove in Hackney was a house where the McGee family were actually driven out by a mixture of poltergeist activity, fires, and a phantom white lady who came out of a wardrobe. If the McGee case, the Spencer Grove case, is in itself a fascinating one, because it actually reached the High Court. High Court in 1969 heard a rent action because the McGees sought a reduction in rent because of the haunting, and they challenged Hackney Council and refused to give them one, and they were upheld by the High Court. So it's quite a significant case in that respect. But here's a building that CJ will know equally as well as myself, from Bury St Edmunds, reputedly haunted by the 15th century Grey Lady. It has a history of phenomena. I was living in Bury St Edmunds 1999, 2006. There were successive licensees who reported strange phenomena. And the most interesting sighting was by a barman who had only just arrived apparently in Bury St Edmunds, had been given a job at Cupola House, and on the 22nd of February 2000, he saw a ghost, what he described as to me 3 days later, as a woman in Victorian clothing, a white Victorian dress, standing on the staircase. And he was shaken up by it when I met him 3 days later in a pub a bit further down the road, which he insisted he'd be transferred to, a fascinating little pub called the Nutshell, reputedly one of the smallest pub in Great Britain, or nearly the smallest in Great Britain. He was still shaking and nervously smoking as he recalled what he'd seen 3 days earlier on a Sunday evening. And he said he was the only one who could see this figure. He estimated he'd seen it for up to 10 minutes just silently standing on the staircase, motionless, and asked me, was this the Grey Lady? Well, I problem with the Grey Lady, there's a number of problems with this story, is the Grey Lady was supposed to be 15th century. The second thing is much of the 15th century Grey Lady lore was actually made up in 1862 by a local lady, a teenager, a Miss Green, who worked for, who was the daughter of a family of printers in in the town. They had a firm called Green's Printers, and they there she made up this story, published a little book on it, a novella. And it caused a sensation. People started talking about a ghostly grey lady. Now, over the years, I've spoken to a number of people who say they have seen a phantom lady at different parts of the town, some of which were connected with the story in the written in 1862, were mentioned in it. There's an old ruined hospital, for instance, that was run by by some nuns in the 14th, 15th century. There's stories of the Grey Lady walking the remains of the Abbey Gardens and appearing in the cathedral churchyard. And I've spoken to one or two witnesses who say they've seen a phantom female. And in fact, there's about 6 places around the town where the Grey Lady is supposed to manifest, and she was very well known amongst school children, and maybe still is today. Certainly when I was growing up, and CJ was, she was the talk of the town. But here, the figure was clearly described as Victoria, and the gentleman was one of a number of staff and licensees who were troubled at Cupola House. Just 3 miles, 2-3 miles away, there is a ruined church in the park of the former Farnham House at Farnham St Genevieve in Suffolk. Farnham Hall was apparently a magnificent building that was demolished in the 1950s. It was the family was, well, it was one that ran out of money. The place was again claimed during the Second World War. It was used, the site area was used as a prisoner of war camp and also as an army base. The army carried on working on using it as a base into the 1950s, and there were stories of a white lady being seen walking from Farnham Hall to Farnham St Genevieve Church. Now, the church actually burnt down in 1775. It was a thatched church, and the local story was that a man had gone out shooting rooks with a fowling piece, and his shot had set alight to the thatched roof, and the church burnt down. But the story was well in place that a white lady walked at midnight from the hall out into the park and stopped by this ruined church, and there were reports of the soldiers seeing her in the 1950s. And as we go around the UK, you find many other stories of these figures of women in white gowns, the white lady, or sometimes the grey lady, haunting a particular place. It's almost like every seaside town has, a bandstand and a pleasure garden, an amusement arcade, and some hotels, and a Chinese restaurant called the Golden Palace or something. Or, you get more or less the same thing at every seaside resort. Well, all around Great Britain, towns, villages, there are stories of white ladies, grey ladies. And pinning them down to any historical figure or personage is very problematic. And I've no doubt that people see these things. I mean, whilst I was working on the update of Phantom Lady, as I was contacted by a woman who'd seen one of these figures cross the road in a village or just outside a village in East Suffolk in August 2022. Yeah, there's no shortage of accounts you can find around the country of people encountering them. Sometimes, quite often, on rural spots, on roads, stories of spectral pedestrians. Are we dealing with one ghost, or are we dealing with many? Is the sort of questions that I come to ask. Because is she really evidence of a surviving person, a trace, whether we call ghosts a mental trace or a spirit? Andrew Green would have leapt in and said, "Well, there's no scientific evidence for spirits. It's an inference at best that we have spirits or spiritual bodies." Um, but then we get into the fascinating conundrums that arise in the philosophy and science of consciousness, is we don't really know what we are when we're alive. What is going on in the brain remains a great mystery. Nature of life itself, our personalities, and so on. There are huge questions which currently psychology and neuroscience can't really answer or understand about us. That's before we get onto the fascinating question of whether some of our consciousness, our spark of mind, might survive death. So I don't doubt people are seeing these kind of ghosts, and they're there in the folklore. I mean, there's just so many of them. Andrew Green was really just scraping the surface with his 145 different places, and so many of them, when you actually say who was this woman haunting this house or hall, boil down to a vague story about a woman, a ghostly woman or apparition in pale clothing that's seen a few times or repeatedly, and wherever one goes. I mean, some of them have even impressed themselves on the landscape. Merton in North Norfolk, near the coast, there's an area called the Shrieking Pits, where a woman in white is said to wander, crying and weeping piteously. She is supposed to be, so according to the story, the mother of a number of children who either died in infancy or whom, in a fit of postnatal depression, she killed or murdered, or something dreadful happened. There's versions of it, but the ghost was so well known that it actually gave its name to a feature of the landscape. You can actually see these pits. They're thought to be prehistoric flint workings originally, but the story is they are haunted by the screaming woman. And of course, you could take that story and you find it in other countries. Lorona, the weeping or shrieking woman in white, is claimed throughout Central America, Latin, South America. The same pattern, the same four features or archetype are repeating themselves. And this is a place I went to about 18 months ago, Lago Colima, Cali in Colombia. Again, a phantom woman in white haunts the road and the lake. And where it gets interesting is you meet people who have actually seen the phantom woman in white. I spoke to one young woman who, 2009, was travelling home near Cali with her family, saw the woman in white cross the road in front of them. She later saw the same figure in their house in the city, as did her sister. And at this point, assuming this story is true, and I have no reason to disbelieve either of the witnesses, the ideas of ghostly recordings, stone tape, really, or electromagnetic residues, start to creak a bit. Japan, well, again, it's an archetypal ghost. The snow woman, the woman who appears in white clothing, is there in Japanese lore. There is even one of these Japanese horror films there, and She reputedly haunts many lonely spots across the 4 islands of Japan. Depends what we mean by ghost, of course. We know people experience apparitions. There's no doubt about it. The question is, what are they? Ghost hunting turns up some evidence. Our principal evidence of any kind of haunting or ghostly phenomena is witness statements. Ghosts don't come to order, but we do have plenty of people who've seen and experienced them, including myself. I have seen one apparition. Unlike what I've been talking about, it was somebody I did recognise. It was a lady. It was a woman I knew, and it was a crisis apparition. She appeared, it turned out on what was the day she actually died in hospital. So people have these experiences, don't doubt it. Sometimes there are physical traces. Photography, instrumental measurements, I have to say, there are anomalies, is what I can say. I wouldn't say they are conclusive proof, but there are also claims of physical marks, or we get object disturbances in haunted houses. I'm quite certain they go on, and certain sounds can be recorded on tape, which are a puzzle or an anomaly. Problem is, much of this can be explained as psi from living minds, telepathy and PK, possibly. But what do we make of some of the other evidence? If you go to the little Museum of Purgatory in Rome, you can see a collection of physical relics, mostly attributed to visits by phantom nuns over the centuries, which was put together and is rather embarrassedly maintained now by certain sections of the Roman Catholic Church. Apparently the Vatican doesn't like to openly acknowledge the little Museum of Purgatory, but it's full of strange traces like burnt nightgowns and burned or marked sheets and bed linen and prayer books, which were supposedly cut or damaged by the apparitions of returning nuns. Is an example of apparently a ghostly hand print, which makes you think this is a very strange hand, to say the least. But it's one of a number of objects preserved in this little museum near the about half hour walk from the Vatican. And of course, at this point, folklorists might justly leap in and say, well, yes, of course, we're talking about something like the Phantom Hitchhiker here. We're talking about a migratory legend, a rumour, a myth, a folk story, friend of a friend story about these women in white, these strange figures. You hear them all over because they are basically folklore. Well, there are a number of reasons I think this doesn't hold together. Firstly, it's never quite clear the vector or transmission route for many of these stories, how they really do end up in sometimes quite detailed stories in very obscure places. Secondly, whilst I have to say the evidence in terms of witness statements or reliable witness statements is fairly small, few and far between, I think, for phantom hitchhikers, the well-known phantom hitchhiker yarn of somebody who's picked up, disappears during the journey. The hapless driver goes to an address which is supposedly shared and learns from the hitchhiker's parents that the girl was run over or died or something horrible happened a year before. It's always, these stories are all over the place, but pinning down actual witnesses is very hard. But with sightings of grey ladies, white ladies, so forth, there are multiple witness sightings of identifiable individuals, and there's successive witness sightings. And as you look through a great many of these, you start to realise that the patterns are strikingly similar. Certain features show up, and in fact, it's something which, if you treated this in a judicial context, would be referred to as similar fact evidence. And that's been used as a legal test in common law traditions, used in Great Britain, in North America, in Commonwealth countries, as a means of proof where you get striking similarities years apart, miles apart in some cases, which prove guilt or some aspect of a case. Because you might be able to rule out one as a mistake or a coincidence, but when you get a succession of witnesses saying or identifying usually the same person, it becomes probative. It's a collection of different testimonies come together to point at proof. Now, I've talked in the past how I think poltergeist activity is so strikingly similar across the generations and across the globe that if you actually tested the evidence in a judicial context, the similar fact rule would say, yes, these things do in fact occur. We may not understand them, but we are talking about real events in the same way as traffic accidents or crimes are real social facts and events. And looking at these sightings of the White Lady or the Lady in White, we get these patterns in the data. Some of them, physical symptoms. We get some cases of long-lasting hauntings spread over many years, even cases of alleged communications. Anyone who wants to look it up, the principle of similar fact goes back to a case called Makin, Attorney General of New South Wales. These striking similarities in testimony taken together become probative. And these ladies in white aren't always wan and harmless, gentle figures in the landscape when they're encountered. Quite often they can be very scary because a persistent feature is the absence of the figure is faceless, or facial features are hidden, distorted, or missing altogether. I mean, we've got a Japanese example here. You find this in witness testimony, again, spread over many, many years, collected since the 1880s by the Society for Psychical Research and numerous authors of ghost books and so on. April 2006, this one reached national news. The now closed Low Valley Arms in near Barnsley, village called Wombwell. Interesting name, Wombwell. Mr. Froggatt, who was the landlord, the last licensee, was woken up by a burglar alarm going off. He got up, went downstairs, found 3 pub TV screens had been switched on, and the toilet were flushing themselves in the ladies. So he went into the toilets and had a terrible shock. He saw what he described as a woman with no face, silvery grey hair, dressed in a white gown. I stood there for about 4 or 5 seconds before I fled in terror. He collapsed outside. His wife they'd already called up the police. The police arrived. An ambulance was called for, but fortunately Mr. Froggatt recovered from this encounter. He said, "It was the ugliest thing I have ever seen. I know what I saw." That's that favourite Danny Robbins line from Uncanny. "And I know there is something there." And suffice it to say, the pub closed down just over 2 years later. Now, that was clearly quite a disturbing experience, and just to say how widespread and dangerous the figure of the woman in white can be. She features in Santeria and in voodoo, African witchcraft. Back in 2017, had a visit over to Zanzibar, and uh, talking to locals on the coast. One of their stories was of a dangerous woman in a white dress who haunted coastal districts and was best avoided. These are, I didn't meet any first-hand witnesses, but it was the same kind of archetypal story. And this entity, whoever she is, can possess you and cause you to have all kinds of fits and seizures or send you into trances. And yeah, they're similar to possession cases: seizures, tics, shaking, convulsions, loss of physical and mental, rambling voices, trance condition. And it's when you read these reports closely, famous haunted house Willington Mill, skeptical gentlemen turn up in the 1840s to wait for the White Lady. Lo and behold, one of them does see her, and she actually walks through him, causing him to collapse, swoon, and he, lost consciousness for several hours. Another story, Worsted Church in Norfolk. There was a story that a white lady returned to the church on Christmas Eve, a time when the church bell was traditionally rung to usher in Christmas Day. And at a local pub, the gentleman was there with his cronies. They started on one Christmas Eve, 1830, talking about the ghost. And this gentleman decided he would go into the church and ring the bell to mark Christmas Day. And he said that if he met the White Lady, he would give her a kiss. Well, his friends sat and waited, and they heard the church clock chime midnight, but no bell followed. And so, after waiting some time, they decided they better find out what had happened to him. They went into the church, eventually found him in a corner of the ringing chamber, hunched up in a kind of fetal position, shaking. This was the description: his limbs shaking, his eyes rolling, and his lips gibbering. He briefly revived to say, "I've seen her there," before lapsing into unconsciousness, dying soon afterwards. This story was looked into by Neil Story, in a writer wrote Ghostly Norfolk. He found, in fact, in the parish records, just after Christmas, the death of a man or the burial of a man early January 1830, which might have been the individual concerned. Again, the records are there, but the story was certainly current and remained in the village for many years. Now, just looking at the description, limbs shaking, his eyes rolling, and his lips gibbering. Now, that can either be a very severe shock, or it's similar to certain accounts of trance possession, similarities that people show in shamanistic encounters with entities. Interesting how you can read the neurophysiology of the ghost encounter. But what's interesting is the persistent patterns we get here. Now, it makes me wonder if some of these traumatized witnesses, if it's really is the trauma, or whether it's the start in a person of something equivalent to spirit possession, for want of a better term, or the beginning of a mediumistic vision. Something's affecting the nervous system. It's either the shock, does the person go into shock and behave like this, or and we know from studies of battlefield casualties, people who've suffered post-traumatic stress disorder, victims of crime, they can show these. But it's also very similar to the sort of patterns of behavior which are found in religious settings, in spiritualist settings, in trance cases, supposedly involving entity possession. But there are fortunately less menacing cases. But the persistent pattern is that the face is hidden or obscured or veiled. You can't make out the facial features. You can see the rest of the figure and clothing and costume, but you can't easily see the face. And one exception, of course, is again mass sightings allegedly of the cult of the Blessed Virgin Mary, another worldwide phenomena. Usually, the Virgin Mary is depicted in dressed in blue, but in quite a few sort of sightings around the globe, she's just described as a shining figure. And of course, there is lots of folklore. We have the Irish banshee. We have the White Lady in certain Norfolk stately homes. There's a tradition of a white lady who appears as a harbinger of death or disaster, and she serves a similar function in German castles, in a district known as the Palatine. So where are we going with this? I began to wonder if there is this ubiquitous archetypal phantom female showing up across the globe, from South America to Japan, across Europe, British Isles, North America, so on. Are we, heaven forbid, getting into anything to do with Robert Graves, poet and author, produced 140 books in a very productive lifetime. Best known for his autobiography, Goodbye to All That, and for writing I, Claudius and Claudius the God. But he wrote many others, and probably his other best known book is a book called The White Goddess, which is on the theme of poetic inspiration. And it hints at there being a spiritual or metaphysical extra-human source to this, which he dubs the White Goddess. And in the book, it's a very complex and difficult book, I must say. He argues that this figure was there in antiquity. It's there within poets. The White Goddess entity or archetype, or however it's described, it's left very vague, but it's something extra non-physical, metaphysical, that inspires poets, sends poets mad, or turns them into writing proper poetry. He argues that it's some kind of real presence. Now, the book has been very influential in modern pagan neo-paganism. A lot of people like the idea of a white goddess or a goddess figure as the center of neo-pagan thought. So it's had a still in print. It's got a wide continuing reception, even if nobody really can properly understand some of where he's going. But equally, there's a skeptical theory that he wrote the book as really a justification for an extramarital affair with this woman, Laura Riding, who became his second wife, and that this was some kind of glorious, rather scandalous attempt to excuse his own infidelities, and that he was always looking for this woman who incorporated the white goddess to inspire him. He was married three times. So there are all kinds of views on what Graves did, what was he about. But when you actually read some of his, I mean, he wrote this when he was 60 in a series of lectures he gave at Cambridge University in a book called The Crowning Privilege. He talks about this white goddess figure as a muse, and he claims that you can find her in poetry as some kind of. It reminds me of the idea of Jung's archetypes, except Graves was actually quite critical of Carl Jung. He didn't like Jung's archetypal interpretation of mythology, but he does, at least on some level, want to believe this. But it's just possibly one direction you could go. Where I'm left with, where we're pointing, is that perhaps we have got a phenomena here, which is doesn't really fit into any paradigm, at least that's normally put forward in scientific ghost hunting, psychical research. Are we dealing with something above and beyond our current theories and hypotheses? Is it some kind of cultural hallucination, as folklorists might suggest? You can, rather like the evidence for demonic possession, you have to look across a lot of different disciplines, and you can find examples of ghostly white ladies which you can approach from a whole range of perspectives. You know, if you look at the literature, this presence of the woman in white is there, whether you're reading psychical research, whether you're reading Graves' poetry or other poets, or if you're looking at anthropology of religion, sociology of religion. You can find psychiatric cases, and you can find it turning up in people's memoirs. I was looking at an account of a man who became a Church of England priest, and he was already in training, and then he describes just as an anecdote of his how he suddenly saw a vision of a woman in white in his house. So what is going on is the question. Certainly it goes a long way beyond what Andrew Green, may forgive me for departing from his ideas and thoughts, were happening. Are we talking about a ghost? Are we talking about a spirit, some kind of superhuman entity, an expression of perhaps of a deeper female principle within cosmos, or within nature itself, or herself, you might say? Are we talking about some kind of expression of the divine feminine? It's a ubiquitous phenomena, I think, that is there when we look at all the evidence in the round. It's fixed at certain locations, but also seems to tie up with the human mind. Clearly defies recognized physical laws, but at the same time seems to be subject to certain restrictions or patterns. Why do we never or rarely see the face of the lady or concerned? But anyway, there it is. This is enabled, thinking on this lines has enabled me to enlarge and bring out the new edition. I'm even building a website at the moment to try and gather some more of this material since editing the book. Speaking at the Scottish UFO and Paranormal Society last month, I collected three new white lady stories were urged upon me, two of which may be just urban myth or apocryphal, but the third was from a gentleman who said, yes, I saw one of these outside Dundee Cemetery in the mid-1970s. So I leave it to you. I suppose there's really three things that I hope that the book, the new edition of Phantom Ladies, will achieve. The first is that it will be a gazetteer for ghost hunters who want to follow up these particular sites. Secondly, that it will hopefully bring a new analysis to, if I'm right, that there is this pattern of phantom ladies in white, whatever they mean. And thirdly, I just hope it will inspire some new thinking from whatever direction. That it will be open to anybody, I think, to advance an idea or a theory or a proposal to try and account for this phenomena. I think it's there, but I'm sort of at a point where, well, all possible hypotheses are there. Yours could be the one that explains it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan. I see that CJ messaged me and he says that he's going to be off for a while, and Claire has returned to her holiday, so I guess you're going to have me for the next 15, 20 minutes or so to go through these questions.
Parallel delight as always.
Thank you very much. That was an absolutely wonderful talk, and I really like the fact that when we're taking what effectively is almost like what I would consider to always be background noise in the accounts of hauntings. They're always there, always in the background, but actually they're almost an entire class haunting in and of themselves. I think that's what you're trying to highlight there. And maybe we ought to go back to the people that we know, where we've heard personal accounts of these things, and also try to add more to your list of accounts there. I mean, in 2007, one of the very first cases where someone told me an account of a haunting actually was indeed a figure that didn't have a face at the side of a road in Nottingham on Bestwood Park Estate. So that was the very first account that someone gave me of an encounter. So it was to hear that story there going, actually, is this a new type of phenomenon, or rather an antiquity kind of case that has always been here, languishing in the background, that this is going to bring forward to engage more discussion. Now, I do apologise regarding the dropping out of the recording. Yeah, my power went off in the house for about 5 seconds or so, and it kicked back in. So hopefully it's not going to have two recordings, but if there is, I could put them together. Hopefully it's captured all of our discussion tonight. So in regards to the questions that are here, the chat box here is absolutely full of discussion. Lots of people discussing cases in regards to, at the time when you were talking, there was Sheena mentions here, there's plenty of reports of various people and many books too on the White Lady of Prestatyn, if that is the correct way of how I pronounce that. And there's comments.
Prestatyn.
Thank you very much appreciated. So, and there's discussions regarding some accounts there as well. But in regards to actual questions, so actually, one of the questions actually is perhaps my own here, is that what are the thoughts to the causes of the colour spectrum? What causes a grey lady or a green lady or a white lady? And what's the perception of how we see them? What do you think is causing that?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, the first question, I suppose, I mean, in terms of white or white as technically isn't really a colour, it's a mixture of colours. It's achromatic, I think is the term, that all colours mixed together end up with white. White, is there on its own. The question is whether these are subjective or objective. Are they part of the light spectrum at all? That is a difficult one, which there's different views amongst ghost hunters, principally whether you can photograph ghosts or not. I feel that my own view is that apparitions are subjective, that they are in the mind's eye, and that's not just based on my own experience. I think that had I had a camera when the apparition I saw appeared, I don't think it would have recorded anything. I think it was a subjective vision, but the thing is, these subjective visions can be seen by more than one person at a time. It's perhaps more akin to dream imagery, but it's a dream that can be seen by people who are awake, more than one at once, or the implication is it can also be seen by animals, or certainly the higher mammals seem to react to the presence of apparitions or hauntings. So we might be dealing with some difficult enough to deal with 3 dimensions most of the time, but are we dealing with some extra dimensional aspect to perception? It's a good one. I mean, if it is the eye, then there is an argument that in the visual cortex, in the eye itself, there are different cells known as rods and cones, and that I think it's on the cones that are on the side of the eyeball, which operate particularly conditions of low illumination, and typically white, they're on the side of the eye. So quite often apparitional accounts, the apparition was seen from the corner of my eye. There's the tradition of fairies appearing in the corner of the eye. So perhaps there is a physical tie-up there. Difficult one to answer.
Yeah, because I thought about, is the colour really related to the fabric? If we are seeing a ghost as an individual who existed at a point in time, and we are seeing some kind of time effect potentially, it might just be their uniform of what they're wearing. It might be them wearing white fabric. And I wonder if that's been considered too.
Well, it's symbolic in some way. White has huge amount of symbolism in different cultures, and it can be a colour of death. It may be the colour of shrouds and burial cloths. Apparently, the fashion for white bridal clothing only sort of grew up in the 1840s onwards and has spread, but that could be a symbolic element. White, it really needs somebody who's a historian of fashion and a historian of art to look into this more closely.
So Dan mentions here that looking for parallels in the appearance of these ghosts is potentially one way to begin, and Sheena mentions that much research has been done on said lady. I mean, are you aware of, like, is there essentially a data table, effectivally what could link these things all together? Does one like that already exist?
Well, I'm hoping to actually establish one. And actually, this has encouraged me to more collecting efforts, I think, simply because it turns out these things are so common. So I have built up quite a collection already, which I haven't made it into this edition. The danger, of course, would be that the material could soon become too big, but at least one should make a start. So that's one of the reasons I'm getting the website going, is to engage in an effort to try and gather more of these.
Okay, so yeah, there's a mention here. Emma mentions about the white night dress as being a norm of the past. So the shrieking pits. There's a question here. Does that phenomenon occur at specific times of the year? Do you know?
I don't know. That's a good question, because the sort of sceptical Norfolk answer is it's the seabirds or the night birds misperceived in strange weather conditions, or the cries of geese migrating. I don't know how it is. I've been up looking for the shrieking pits. They're actually quite hard to find, but never attempted a vigil there. It's difficult, of course, with sound. On the whole, I think, as Eric Maple says, Norfolk ghosts are quite a noisy lot, and he picks this one. Problem with anything in the open air is sound could be misperceived. All kinds of things can sound very strange, particularly when sound travels better after dark. Somebody might be willing to do a vigil or hold some kind of sitting there. So,
well, I think there actually is an ASSAP Norfolk. Perhaps we should task that to them to go and have a bit of a vigil up there. Karen Farrell mentions here the white lady described in the article is a feature of the promenade and not one that's supposed to have followed anyone. I believe that might have been a conversation that was happening in the chat there rather than a question. Some people have said thank you very much. That's much appreciated. Again, more jokes about Norfolk there, 5 fingers and no thumbs and all that. Has there been any mock trials that were conducted, to your knowledge? I think you made a mention earlier about veridical evidence being could be subjected in court to actually exist. You know, if that has any trials occurred to your knowledge.
Well, it's certainly come up in court cases in scattered jurisdictions over the years. Possibly the most significant one might be a case from Scotland in 1944, which involved a fire at a place called Pitmilly, where the dispute was over whether the insurance should pay out, and they argued it was a poltergeist type fire. And the claimant won. It was accepted that there was poltergeist, something happened. I mean, the court can't help answer scientific questions. All it can do is just judge on the evidence. I mean, the courtroom can't tell you whether psychic phenomena exist or not anymore. They can determine any other scientific theory, because courtroom is not a clinical laboratory or a testing ground. I mean, sometimes there are experiments to do with products that may be conducted, but it's really in terms of what is the balance of evidence tying up with the law. But again, the Spencer Grove case in 1969 was not whether the house was really haunted. It was whether the evidence for the haunting had been wrongly omitted and ignored or dismissed by it was the Rent Tribunal in Hackney, who questioned this family, and they said, well, it's all due to the ghost. That's why we want the rent reduction. We did flee in the middle of the night. And they said, oh, you're very silly people. We shouldn't run away in the middle of the night. We're not giving you anything. Well, we don't believe the ghost stuff. And the High Court overturned that decision and said the tribunal had to do it all over again because they shouldn't have rejected the testimony on that basis. And in fact, their rent went down to about 25p a week by the time. But in the end, they left the house. The place was demolished. There's been a number of cases. There was one in the United States in 1996. It was an insurance poltergeist damage one where the people won. Equally, the courts have come down against hauntings such as Lowe's Cottage in Derbyshire in 1998, where the owners tried to sue the vendors. From time to time, these cases do come up where they are tested. And it is where it usually to do with damage or property. So it's a mixture, like all court cases.
Dave Sylvia mentions there was an episode of Monkey where there was an entire village inhabited by faceless demons. So yeah, I can remember that episode quite well. Stu Neville says, isn't La Llorona described as a white, faceless, vengeful spirit?
In some descriptions, yes, she's. I think there's even been a sort of horror film or series modelled upon it. Interestingly, in Jan Brunvan's book, The Vanishing Hitchhiker, and other American urban myths, which is one of the classics of urban myth study, he deals, of course, with the Phantom Hitchhiker, and he says that, in some places such as Indiana, it seems to have actually grown out of the pre-existing belief about Llorona from the Hispanic community. So it's the old question: which came first, the story or the phenomena?
I guess the phenomena could evolve over time if that's the case. Many discussions here about real regards to a case over there. Let's have a look on here. Ruth Morris says, interesting that some people will hallucinate just before having an epileptic seizure. I've done some work on non-epileptic seizures, which are a serious medical condition, but there is little known about these seizures. I wonder if any people experience hallucinations, visions, before these type of seizures start. And you know that I like to look at the medical psychological angle, Alan.
I think that would be a very worthwhile thing to pursue, because it is a very complex area, and it needs people who've got requisite knowledge, like Ruth, and practical experience, I think, as well.
Oh yeah, Emmy Harvey mentions that she's had seizures herself, but no visions beforehand. I wonder how replete that actually is. I'd be definitely fascinated to find out. Dan mentions also it's well known that a lot of people suffer from a deficiency of certain fatty acids that causes impulsive behavior, like mild seizures, and the deficiency can be severe. So is that the case? Like, is the biology of also people's experience also perhaps bothering the eye and the perception of their experiences?
Well, again, these are all avenues that I would urge people to look in any direction at the state of our knowledge at the moment. Is all these angles strike me as worth exploring. We collect a lot of stories, but perhaps often we don't know enough about the actual witness and their clinical and physiological circumstances. There have been attempts to link ghostly phenomena, haunting phenomena, with epilepsy, for instance, temporal lobe problems. But saying that, I mean, the first major study I know of was William Roll, who looked through historic poltergeist cases but found only in about 4 or 5%. But was there clearly evidence of a sort of central nervous system or brain disorder mentioned? But again, it's interesting when you look at accounts of poltergeists and the poltergeist agent. Quite often there's something like sleepwalking, or there's some kind of some kind of trance or fainting fits and things like this. It happened at Enfield, for instance. Whereas actually it wasn't just focused on the children. The mother was known to faint completely, dead away for periods. I think there's a lot there to be looked at more closely. In fact, in most cases we don't have much in the way of medical evidence. At the same time, you can get some skeptics who try and concoct the most wonderful theories about neurophysiological disturbances. I remember reading an account of the poet Strindberg, who may just have been completely insane at certain points in his life. He believed he was picked on by spirits and entities. And one neuroscientist produced a wonderful explanation based on neuroscience of what Strindberg, who died in the early 20th century, had wrong with him, except he never looked at Strindberg's medical records, even if they survived. We have absolutely no evidence of what Strindberg's physiological condition is. He's been dust and ashes for 100 years. So, you've got to take all these explanations. If you test them in the would they stand up in court, I suppose, as a medical one, but I certainly think that angle is worth explaining. The other thing which occurred to me, and you see more of it today, there's increasing welcome and acceptance and claims against discrimination against people who are suffering mental illness. People, increasingly there's a growing awareness of neurodiversity, and that we must be more accepting and tolerant of people who are neurodiverse, with a whole spectrum of different conditions and disorders. Yet, curiously, there doesn't seem to be any tolerance that's growing up simultaneously with people who actually have psychic experiences. You can make all kinds of claims that you may suffer from dyslexia or whatever, any particular syndrome or autism, and people are quite rightly accommodating and understanding, and that's getting traction in the law and employment and so on. If you start going to work and start saying I saw an alien or I saw a ghost, I mean, you're going to still run into a huge amount of prejudice. And I think there is really a step forward socially that needs to be taken with paranormal experiences. It seems that we're quite prepared to tolerate all kinds of non-binary conditions and diversities these days. But you start saying, I had a UFO experience or a contactee, or you start saying, I've seen a ghost, or I have poltergeist phenomena, you still run into a wall of prejudice. And this. So I think there's a lot here that needs to be looked at. I mean,
I like that.
I'm going off on a bit of a tangent there, but
that's what's fascinating.
We're watching developments in things like employment law. You see the tolerances are shifting, but against certain people who, as far as we know, many people have, as far as they know, that they have no medical reason why they should be seeing an apparition or feel that their house is haunted. It's just something that comes upon them, but they're given less credit or understanding than perhaps they deserve, I think.
Yeah, so there's something here that Stu Neville mentioned, and perhaps contains a bit of a joke here. In both old Celtic and Roman murals, white female forms are often seen alongside big black shapes, which is interesting. Is there almost as many white woman cases compared to black figure cases, shadow people, shall we say? And is that black figure and a shadow person the same thing? And is there almost an equal measure of them?
Well, one writer I didn't mention is Patrick Harper, who is basically, he wrote a book called Daemonic Reality, which is about the strange territory between the imagination and experience, and looked at various phenomena, UFOs, elementals, fairies, Bigfoot. He actually has a chapter called Ladies, where he talks about the folkloric white lady ghost, and he actually links them with mention of black shapes. He says that they somehow contrast with with black dog legends and stories and sightings. This again, it's a good question. I mean, one of the cases in the book, the Castle Rushen on the Isle of Man was originally supposed to be haunted by a white lady or grey lady. When I made some inquiries on a visit to the Isle of Man in 2012, she, however, had turned into a lady in black. So these things do change or evolve. Again, we need to collect the data, I think.
There's a report, I think, from Vinderland. It's one of the Roman forts where there are murals of the black shape, the Junius Cuculati, and the white woman, and the black dog, and people have seen all three of them separately. And in fact, at one point, I think Steve Jones told me together. At one point, there was basically a big black shape, a white lady, and a black dog, witnessed around the same time by the same group of people. Which is kind of, but different people saw different things. So whether they're different aspects of the same thing, just through a cultural filter, is an interesting thing. But certainly the big black shapes are now being seen. It wasn't actually a joke. They are being seen as big feet, simply because anything 7 foot tall with a pointed head is now culturally identified as a Bigfoot. Whereas 100 years ago, it was a phantom monk. You know, it's the same thing. It's just being seen through a different cultural filter, isn't it? You know, yeah. And presumably white women were often seen as nuns, because that's how nuns tended to look in medieval times, I guess.
There's a bit of an off-the-beat question here, but it's perhaps worth throwing in your way. Alan, the question, is there any records of ghosts interacting with insects? Perhaps like reacting to a ghost near a hive, perhaps? Anything like that come across your way at all?
Ghosts and insects? Well, I did write a column for the 14 Times years ago about connections with ghosts and insects, and from memory, there was a strange, bizarre insect seen in the rectory of garden at Borley before it burnt down. But frankly, since everything was seen at Borley or experienced, we can't put too much weight on it. There was a curious case about what appeared to be phantom moths, which was mentioned in a magazine called The Atlantic in 1941, which I think was in a house in South Africa. There, that less than reliable and creditable source, Elliot O'Donnell, claimed to have encountered infestations of black beetles in haunted houses. There are traditions of phantom butterflies. One or two places. Butterflies are symbol of the soul in some cultures. In South America, there's known as the mariposa in Spanish. It's supposed to be a transformation of the soul. There's one or two places. One of them, I think, is in Bath. Another one is in Bournemouth, where there is a red admiral, a ghostly red admiral, which is supposed to be a spirit or a representation floating around. So there are links and connections but very much in folklore. Again, there's a fascinating field in itself there.
Absolutely. So I think that kind of brings us a bit of a round on the general speed of the questions on here. So I want to say thank you very much. I'll thank you on behalf of ASSAP